Okay, this is going to be your test, your reteach for the retest for the Unit 2 biology test. We covered a number of things within that unit, some of which are food webs and everything that goes along with it, symbiosis, natural selection, and last but not least, ocean interactions. So these are our four main topics that I'm going to be covering in this tutorial. First things first, food webs. Every food web, it does the same function. So basically, it shows the flow of energy within an ecosystem. All energy begins at the sun. The way it enters a food web is through a producer. For example, grass. So all food webs have to begin with a producer. It doesn't have to be grass. It could be some type of a bacteria that produces energy via photosynthesis. Could be some type of a protist. Could be algae. Could be sea kelp. Could be any number of things. Could be trees. Could be corn or wheat or rice. Those are all producers. But ultimately, it begins with some producer that gets energy from the sun. How does it do that? Photosynthesis. Energy from the sun goes to that producer. That producer is able to do photosynthesis and able to produce its own energy from light and water and carbon dioxide. So this, along with those, makes this produce energy in the form of glucose. So the role of a producer in a food web is that it's able to produce its own food. It gets energy from the sun and transforms it. From there, we have a primary consumer of some sort. So this is our producer. Primary consumer. Why is it called a primary consumer? Because it's the first consumer in a food web. This is not a consumer. Grass is a producer. So our primary consumer could be, for example, a grasshopper. Our secondary consumer could be, for example, a lizard. And then our tertiary consumer could be, for example, a hawk. So this is a simple food chain. It's not a food web. Why is it a food chain? Because each thing gets eaten by one thing and eats another thing. So we've got our primary, secondary consumer is our second consumer. Tertiary consumer is our third consumer in a food chain. It doesn't have to be one thing eats one thing, though. In real life, other things will eat this grass. So, for example, a rabbit will eat the grass. And maybe the rabbit gets eaten by the hawk. So now the rabbit takes the role of a first level consumer or a primary consumer. And the hawk takes the role of a secondary consumer. So it doesn't always mean it's going to be a tertiary level consumer. It depends on which food chain you look on. Now, let's talk about competition in the role of a food web. Competition means that organisms are competing for the same resources. There are a number of resources that organisms can compete for. Could be water, could be air, could be just space, could be sunlight. In the case of grass, if it's competing with trees, the tree's probably going to win on that one. It's probably going to get more light than grass because the tree's taller. So there is competition in a food web. In this case, we have competition because the rabbit is eating the same thing as the grasshopper. So based on that competition, if there is an increase in the number of rabbits, what will happen to the number of grasshoppers? If we increase the number of rabbits, we decrease the amount of grass available, and therefore we decrease the amount of grasshoppers available. In turn, if the grasshoppers and the rabbit are competing for the same food source, then we should see a decrease in their population as well. So competition is not good for organisms, because generally that means that it's harder to get the things they need to survive, and therefore they die. So that's a decrease in population. So let's give another example here. Let's do another one. Let's do bugs, insects eat plants, and those insects can get eaten by lizards, or they can get eaten by a frog, and that frog can get eaten by a coyote, and that coyote can get eaten by the hog. So we have a producer, primary consumer, secondary consumer, tertiary consumer, and even a quaternary consumer in this food chain. Or it could be primary, secondary, tertiary, depending on how you look at it. Regardless, we can see here that the lizard and the frog are both competing for insects. So based on that, based on the fact that they're both competing for that, that's going to be a challenge for them to survive. So in other words, more than likely, if one of the population increases, the other population will decrease. So for example, if the lizard population increases, then that's going to have mass effect on other organisms within the food chain. Decrease in grasshoppers, a decrease in number of insects, a decrease in number of frogs because there's less food for them. So the general idea here is that competition is not good. We've got our producers start a food chain. We've got our consumers. The first one is primary, the second one is secondary, the third one is tertiary. So that's it for food web. So that's pretty much all you need to know. The only other thing I could possibly think of that you might need to know would be like carnivore, herbivore, and omnivore. So as a reminder, a carnivore eats only animals, eats meat. A carnivore eats meat. And you know that because of the root, which is carne, in Spanish means meat. Herbivores eat only plants. And the root of that is herb or herb. Herbs are like thyme, rosemary, things that grow on plants. And last but not least, we have omnivore that eats all. Omni means literally all. So this eats plants and animals. Okay. Second thing we talked about was symbiosis. So with symbiosis, by definition, it's just a close relationship between two organisms. There are three types. We've got mutualism, we've got parasitism, and we've got commensalism. So with mutualism, that means it's mutually beneficial to both organisms involved in that. An example of that would be, so this is good for both organisms. So an example of that would be like a bee and a flower. The bee is able to pollinate the flower, so therefore the flower benefits because now it's able to reproduce. And the bee, in the process of pollinating that flower inadvertently, is getting nectar, is getting food, energy. So it's good for both. Another example would be like the clownfish and the anemone. If you've ever seen Finding Nemo, clownfish live in anemones. And the reason is because anemones will sting predators that pass through. They don't sting the clownfish because the clownfish has a special mucus built up on it. So the clownfish benefits because it gets protection, and the anemone benefits because it's able to clean all the excess food off of the clownfish, and thereby it gets energy. Another example, or another type of symbiosis, parasitism. You guys know this as parasite and host. So a parasite-host relationship is one where The parasite benefits, but the host is hurt. An example of that would be like a mosquito biting you. That's one that we can all kind of relate to, especially here in Texas in the summer. The parasite benefits because the mosquito, so mosquito in you is an example. Mosquito benefits because it's able to get energy from you in the form of blood, and you get hurt because you have a minor allergic reaction. Technically, you're losing a little bit of blood in the process. If you got swarmed by mosquitoes, that would be a little bit easier to see because you would lose a more sizable amount of blood. Another example would be a flea or a tick on a dog. So the flea and the tick benefit because they get energy. The dog is harmed because it's losing energy. Another example would be a tapeworm inside you. Another example would be the botfly or the parasitic wasp or that weird, creepy thing that lives in that fish's mouth. All of those things, those parasites benefit. And then the host, the thing that the parasite lives on or in, is hurt. The last but not least is commensalism. Last type of symbiotic relationship. This is a one that students have a hard time remembering. One organism benefits, and the other organism really is unaware of what's going on. It doesn't care. It doesn't get affected. An example of that would be like a shark and a barnacle. So the shark is unaffected by the barnacle. The barnacle can attach itself to the shark, and thereby it can kind of filter feed on anything that the shark is near. The barnacle benefits because it gets energy, and it also gets a little bit of protection from that shark. But the shark really doesn't care. It's not benefited. It's not hurt. But symbiosis. Next thing we talked about was natural selection. So natural selection is, by definition, a theory that was come up with by Charles Darwin back in a long time ago. He was traveling to Galapagos Islands studying finches, and he noticed that some finches had certain beaks, and on other islands they looked pretty similar except they had different beaks. So what he determined was those beaks were different because they had adapted to their environment to eating certain types of food. Certain types of food were available on some islands and not available on other islands. So he basically coined this phrase, survival of the fittest, which literally means the fittest organisms will survive. Pretty straightforward topic there. So the organism with the best adaptations are able to survive better and make babies with the adaptation. So let me give you an example of that. An example would be a bird. No, that's a terrible example. How about let's just do the giraffe example. Giraffe with a long neck. So you have giraffe with long neck and a giraffe with a short neck. So they have different traits. One is better suited for survival. Probably going to be the long-necked giraffe. So over time, let's pretend for a second that the food sources that are down low get depleted. So the only time a giraffe can get food is if it's up in trees. Well, this organism is better adapted for survival. So it will survive because it's able to get food better. This organism does not survive. It dies of starvation. So based on that, this organism is able to survive. It's able to pass on its traits. It's able to have babies. And those babies have long necks. Another example we did in class was the peppered moth. Originally the trees were light in color. So that facilitated light moths being able to survive better. So the light moths were able to survive better because they were able to camouflage and avoid predators. Pretty easy to understand there. The dark moths get eaten. So over time what happens is the Industrial Revolution occurs, and suddenly that light environment turns to a dark environment because of all the smoke that's being put out from factories. It's changing the environment to a darker color. So what happens then is suddenly the light moths get eaten. Dark moths survive because they're able to camouflage, and therefore if they survive, they make babies. So those babies will more than likely have a dark coloration and be able to survive and pass on their traits. The ones that do survive that are light survive and make light moth babies, and those babies are more likely to get eaten. So over time, over the course of several decades, you're going to see a transition from a mostly light moth population to a mostly dark moth population. So that's natural selection. The last thing we talked about was human interaction with ocean systems. So humans interact with ocean systems, and as a general rule, it's bad. So things we do: overfishing. We fish too much, and suddenly there's not enough fish left to make babies. So therefore, there's less fish in the sea, which in turn means possible damage to food webs, and it also means that we don't have very much food left. So less fish equals damage to food webs and less food for us. Second thing would be damage to coral reefs, or damaging reefs. People come by, they want to take a little piece for a souvenir if they go on vacation, if they go snorkeling, take a little piece of coral reef with them, no big deal, it's just a little piece. Over time it adds up. Any kind of pollutants that we're putting in the water can also damage this, resulting in less homes for fish. Less homes for fish means they get eaten, which means less fish. That's a problem. Third one would be like oil spills. I think that's pretty self-explanatory. When we spill oil, it causes a damage to the environment, which in turn causes fish to die. They can ingest that oil, or they can be just contaminated by it. Fourth one would be trash and plastics. There's actually a gigantic pile of garbage in the middle of the Pacific Ocean right now, and that kills organisms. They mistake plastic as food, they eat it, suddenly they're dead. If you ever look up, if you have a moment to look up on Google, plastic albatross or something like that. Plastic albatross is a bird that, albatross are a bird that eat plastics, and so basically over time what happens is that plastic accumulates in their system, they can't digest it, and eventually they die. And so what you're left with is an albatross corpse that gets decomposed, and you can see all the plastic that was inside it. The fifth way that we interact with ocean systems is going to be cattle or ranching and fertilizers. So this causes runoff of things like manure and cow urine, as well as fertilizers associated with farms and things like that. So with this runoff, when it rains, it's going to take all those pollutants, all those chemicals, and push them out into the ocean. So the effect of that is that we have an increase in the amount of algae, which in turn causes problems with food webs. I'm just going to go ahead and skip to the big one, which is artificial reefs. So artificial reefs is one good way that we interact with ocean systems. Because we have already damaged reefs, we try to repair them, we try to give fish homes. So an artificial reef is a man-made fish house, basically. So that's good because fish can live in there, they can evade predators better if they're in a home. So in turn, what does that do? It increases the population of fish. It provides them with a shelter, promotes reproduction, So that means more fish in the sea. That's a good thing for us, especially if we eat fish. It also can control erosion near oceans or near coastlines. That's not a huge thing. I'm not really super concerned with that. I'm mostly concerned with that you know that information about artificial reefs. So humans are trying to intervene to kind of repair some of the damage that we've done, but we tend to do more damage than we do good. So those are the topics that are on your test. If you need any additional assistance or if you want to look over your old test to see what you missed, that way I can help you a little bit better. I hope that you take the time to do that. Otherwise, you may want to also look over your notes and your study guide before you start your test. I wish you the best. Thanks.